All right, going back to the main part of the book. Of course, I personally do not believe in becoming organized. That's my personal belief, unless it's simply in servitude toward Christ. However, and at the same time, I'm not against people who are organized or find themselves in an organized church, nor with those who are comfortable within such institutions. By no means am I saying anything negative about the attendees. I just don't agree with the governmental type systems that construct many modern day churches. But if it may seem that I am attacking the organized church, please know that I'm certainly not doing that. I'm merely saying things concerning their governmental structure that has become its backbone, and of the mindset of many of their leaders who fulfill Scripture, which describe them as becoming workers of iniquity, such as in Matthew 7:22 through 23. Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name? And in your name have cast out many devils, and in your name did many wonderful works. And then I will profess unto them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you worker of iniquity. Because they deny the proper growth of God's children. But does this only concern some who consider themselves organized? No, for even those who do not consider themselves to be organized, they are indeed in the same boat together with them who consider themselves to be so. This stretches the whole globe of Christendom. But as far as carnal flesh completely taken over as a headship, please know that it could be very possible for any of us, anybody, to be in danger of such a thing within the confines of an actual church building, or of when a ministry is in charge, which is another subject that is going to be covered herein also. So, and because I had declared this, doesn't mean that every church leader out there are bad people. Of course, I am not saying that, and neither do I even believe such a thing. But in any construct in life, whether it be in politics, in religion, the business world, you're going to have your bad apples in any bunch. Therefore, it is to these bad apples, let's admit it, they are amongst us, of whom I am referring to. On the other hand, please know that God did indeed have his hand in the construction of these said industries and rude leaders for one reason or another. Many of the reasons, I feel, are not for a good outcome. Even when things are godly ordained, there's still a balance of good and evil. With that, I've got our second explanatory note. For even when things are godly ordained, there's still a balance of good and evil. I had an extensive detail, went over this position in a previous book in this Seeking the Everlasting Gospel teaching series called Blaming God, Is It Really His Fault? Even if such a notion seems wrong or strange to mention, I fully believe this to be the case. It's very important in the understanding of how God's kingdom works. I will herein be showing examples of how corrupted ministers have entered into the church world. Not by name, but by example. And that even though evil in nature, people still got what they needed from God. As Jesus had so curiously pointed out in Matthew 7:22 through 23. And that even though they were workers of iniquity, God's children still got prophesied by these evil men. They casted out devils. They did wonderful works in the name of the Lord. Yet they themselves never entered into that blessed kingdom. So one may curiously ask why that is so, and why God even allows such men to flourish in his church world. Well, that's another thing that we're going to be covering within the pages of this book. This first chapter, again, it's just like the introduction. It's more of an introduction for the rest of the pages. Such as the fact that people want to latch onto a fleshly king when God himself deserves that position only. Now, I don't want to give away too much right now, just yet, for this is going to be addressed in the upcoming chapter, so stay tuned for that. So let's go back to the main part of the book. Now, I have many brothers and sisters within the massive walls of these institutions, these organized denominations. I care little what denomination they may represent, for those curtains called denominations are not thick enough on any side to deny their relationship with me. And I really mean that. Being so the case, whether Baptist, Pentecostal, oneness, any state, I want fellowship with all of them if they're willing to have it with me. Now with that, well, let me finish this sentence. Because I know that the word denomination should not be a wall of separation between God's true children. So let me go to our third explanatory note. For I want fellowship with all of them if they're willing to have it with me. Again, I do not want to be misunderstood here. I'm not boldly declaring that we're going to go run into the established church buildings out there and start yelling, "Come out of her, my people, and be not partakers of her sins." For one thing, I do not believe that just because you have a church building or that you have an organization that it automatically places you into sin. I mean, come on. As I've already stressed, God himself has ordained the church building in its present form for one of several reasons, many of which are good reasons, some of which are bad reasons, as I'm going to continue to explain. But I also believe that if God places a young man or a young woman into the hands of a caretaker, that caretaker should be honored for their parental role. And with that loaded statement should come a host of explanations. In fact, one of the many purposes of this book is to address what a proper caretaker even is, of what role that they are to play in the church world, and of what kind of honor that they should receive. Or certainly, honor to a caretaker can either be too light or it can go way too far. I've seen both. But back to what I was saying. If a godly ordained minister has care over a person whilst that attendee is in their child years, not in actual human years, but in the fact that they're still children in their understandings, then they do not need to be torn from that union prematurely. Else confusion and damage could certainly set in. Not only, but as the Apostle Paul had suggested concerning another man's servant, we are not to judge that situation incorrectly. So let's go to Romans 14:4. Who are you that judges another man's servant? To his own master he stands or falls. Yea, he shall be holden up, for God's able to make him stand. Now, we need not necessarily look upon the situation as the world might see it. That is concerning a servant in this particular passage, and comparing that to an actual bought slave. Even though Paul, in other areas of his writings, does address actual slavery. There are other places, though, such as this passage, where he addresses being a servant or a slave to certain church situations, especially since he spoke of this right smack dab in the middle about church issues. Please read verse 1 on down to see. Also, the Greek word used in Romans 14:4 does not even denote an actual slave, but rather a sort of a house servant, and a church worker can certainly fall into that category. So let's go to servant from Strong's Greek Dictionary. Of course, Strong's was published in 1890. It's public domain. A fellow resident, that is, menial domestic, household servant. But even if slave were meant in that passage, that is, slavery as we do know it today, it's not too far off base to say that we can be a slave to another person if we are in servitude toward them, even in a church. In fact, being in servitude to Christ, the original Greek word doulos, translated as servant in the King James Version, actually refers to us being God's slaves rather than just workers in his kingdom. As it says in Romans 1:1, Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, separated into the gospel of God. So servant, doulos, from Strong's Greek Dictionary there, a slave, literally or figuratively, involuntarily or voluntarily. Frequently, therefore, in a qualified sense of subjection or subserviency. Bond, bondman, servant. But again, concerning Romans 14:4, Paul, like Jesus, was always in teaching form. And He loved to use parables and allegories and figures and similes throughout his letters. Please see my book, In the Beginning It Was Spiritual from the Very Start, for a detailed explanation about that. That is, the different metaphors and stuff like that that's used in the Bible. And here we can see how that if a person is in servitude toward another person, even in a church situation between saint and pastor, then we are not allowed to interfere or intervene into that relationship, even if we think the person's ready to come up to a higher position, unless God tells us to do so or gives us permission to do so. But you better make sure that it's God telling you to do it. Honestly, if the saint is not ready to leave that kind of relationship, that even if it's abusive, they're going to defend it with all their might, even if they're in that terrible situation. But at the same time, and if they are even called to do so, there will be a time when God's ready for that person to move away from their current position to explore other areas of his grace and kingdom to get into a more advanced position. That is, if the minister or pastor in question actually allows them to grow up, or if they felt led to just simply leave that church in their due season. And when ready, they'll know it, and you'll know it, if everybody is working within God's Spirit. And at that time, fellowship will be more permissible and possible. I personally do not believe in proselyting another person without God's will being enforced, or without his permission being granted, of which situation will only happen when a dictator is being abusive toward a saint. Yes, I use the word dictator, and I'm going to be using it more often in here. God alone says when a person is ready to advance from any given situation. Frankly, we may not be gifted enough to determine or judge anybody else's position. Matthew 7:1-5, judge not that you be not judged, for with what judgment you judge, you shall be judged, and with what measure you met, it shall be measured to you again, etc. But once a person is free, if they are ever granted to be so from God, is an adult, and if they're willing to, then I want healthy fellowship with them, no matter their previous or present affiliation. But nevertheless, all fellowship has to be within the confines of what has been laid out in Scripture. Has to be. At the same time, though, I'm not here suggesting that it's a preferable thing for a person to be in servitude to another person. Of course not. But, and as I had explained in my book, Blaming God, Is It Really His Fault? God may send us through some bad situations for our benefit, for our education, and for our growth. So, the bottom line of what I'm meaning is for us not to judge unrighteously, John 7:24, which I quoted earlier, and for us to be ever ready and prepared for if and when God needs us to help other people. Not only come to Him to begin with, but to plant and to water in due season so that God can give the proper increase.